Ethan Miller was tired of the city's noise, both literal and metaphorical. As a freelance investigative journalist, he'd spent the last 5 years chasing stories that were little more than glorified gossip. Scandals of minor politicians and exposés on under-the-table business deals that no one truly cared about. He needed something real, something with substance, a narrative that didn't feel manufactured for clicks. Sitting in his cramped apartment in Washington, D.C., he scrolled through a forgotten corner of the internet, a forum dedicated to lost American folklore. It was here, buried under threads about forgotten mining towns and ghost sightings, that he found it. A single, cryptic post. The title was unassuming: Caldwell Family of Hollow Ridge. The body of the post was even more so, a rambling account from a long-deleted user, hinting at a family so reclusive and strange that the local communities had simply excised them from memory. The post described generations of oddities, a lineage marked by a quiet, unsettling malice that seemed to infect their very bloodline. It was a possession, the user claimed, but not of the ghostly kind. It was something else. Something that twisted and warped them from the inside out, passed down from father to son for over a century. The post was dismissed as fiction by the few comments it had received, but something about its tone, the genuine fear and lack of sensationalism, stuck with Ethan. He did a quick search. Caldwell, Hollow Ridge, nothing. No news articles, no census data beyond the early 20th century. It was a ghost family, not because they were dead, but because they had vanished from the public record entirely. This was his story. The journey into the Appalachian Mountains was a gradual descent into a different world. The interstate gave way to winding state roads, which eventually narrowed into a cracked asphalt ribbon clinging to the side of a mountain. The vibrant autumn colors faded into a muted palette of gray and brown. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The mountains themselves seemed to press in, their ridges like bony knuckles against a perpetually gray sky. Ethan's GPS lost signal miles before he reached the small town of Blackwood, a collection of tired-looking houses and a single gas station that doubled as a general store. He pulled up to the gas station, the old bell above the door jangling as he entered. The air inside was warm and smelled of stale coffee and gasoline. An elderly man with a face like worn leather looked up from behind the counter, his eyes sharp and suspicious. "Just passing through," Ethan said, trying for a friendly smile. "Looking for the Caldwell place." The man's expression didn't change. He simply set down the rag he was holding and leaned forward, his voice a low rumble. "Don't know anyone by that name." Ethan was prepared for this. "Hollow Ridge. A dirt road, I think?" The old man's eyes narrowed further, the silence stretching between them. Finally he spoke, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Some things are best left alone, son. Folk around here, they mind their own business. You should, too." The warning was clear, and it only fueled Ethan's resolve. He thanked the man and left, purchasing a local map from a spinner rack by the door. He found the road easily enough, a rutted, overgrown path that forked off the main road, hidden behind a thicket of tangled rhododendron bushes. The canopy of trees above was so dense that it blocked out most of the sky, plunging the road into a permanent twilight. The silence here was different from the city. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a heavy, watchful quiet. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed magnified, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. He drove for a few miles, the road growing progressively worse until it was barely more than 2 tire tracks in the mud. Then, through a break in the trees, he saw it. The house was a dilapidated 2-story farmhouse, its white paint long since peeled away to reveal rotting wood. A wide, empty porch sagged precariously in the front. The windows were either boarded up or shattered, gaping black holes against the pale face of the house. The land around it was a chaotic mess of weeds and wild, unpruned trees that scraped against the side of the house in the faint breeze. A single, rusting swing set stood in the yard, swaying slightly, its chains groaning in protest. Ethan cut the engine and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. The air was colder here, filled with the undeniable feeling of being watched. He took out his camera, but something stopped him from raising it. A shadow, not quite human, flickered in one of the upstairs windows, and then another, smaller one in a downstairs pane. He froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. It wasn't a trick of the light. He was sure of it. He took a tentative step toward the house, but the feeling of being observed intensified, becoming a physical weight on his shoulders. A cold dread, a feeling of being unwelcome in a place that held a deep, festering secret. He saw something else then, carved into the trunk of a large oak tree near the porch. A simple, crudely etched symbol of a hand with 5 long, unnatural fingers. He turned and hurried back to his car, his instincts screaming at him to leave. The drive back to Blackwood felt twice as long, every shadow in the trees seeming to hold a hidden threat. He checked into the town's only motel, the key feeling heavy and cold in his hand. After a quick, nervous dinner, he returned to his room, the feeling of unease still clinging to him. He was about to unlock his door when he noticed it. A small, neatly folded piece of paper had been slipped under his door while he was gone. He picked it up, his hands shaking slightly. He unfolded it to find a single, chilling message, written in a spidery scrawl that looked ancient, but the ink was undeniably fresh. "You saw what you weren't supposed to. We know who you are." He felt a sudden, visceral jolt of fear. They hadn't just been watching him. They knew. The story had found him. If you're captivated by Ethan's terrifying discovery and want to see what happens next, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this unfolding nightmare. The note was a ghost in itself. A tangible piece of fear slipped under the door. Ethan stared at the scrawled words. "You saw what you weren't supposed to. We know who you are." Until the letters seemed to writhe on the page. His first instinct, a cold, rational impulse born from years of self-preservation, was to leave. Pack his bags, get in his car and drive back to the city, where the monsters were all human and their motives were simple: money, power, and fame. But then his eyes fell on the note again. They knew. They had been watching him since he left the main road. Fleeing wouldn't erase what they knew. It would only make him a target in an empty wilderness. The journalist in him, the part that craved a real story, not just a headline, whispered a more dangerous thought. They're afraid. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his wallet, a grim souvenir. The next morning, the sun was a faint, watery suggestion behind a thick layer of clouds. Ethan decided his best bet was to talk to someone else, someone who wasn't the wary old man at the gas station. He found a small diner with a handful of locals sipping coffee and exchanging hushed words. He approached the counter, ordering a coffee and striking up a conversation with the young woman serving him, her name tag reading Shelley. She had the same cautious eyes as the man at the gas station, but without the ingrained hostility. "I'm an independent researcher," Ethan began, his voice low and non-threatening. "I'm looking into the history of some of the older families around here. Ever heard of the Caldwells?" Shelley stiffened, her movements becoming jerky as she refilled his cup. "Heard the name," she said, her eyes flicking nervously toward a table of older men. "Old family. Don't live in town. They keep to themselves." "Keep to themselves for a while now, it seems," Ethan pressed gently. "I was trying to find some records, maybe at the library." Shelley hesitated, then leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "The library's got some old stuff, local history section. But if you're looking for things on them, you won't find much. My grandma says they were always strange. People just decided to forget about them. She paused, her gaze distant. My great-aunt knew them, said they didn't talk much, not even to each other. Communicated in some weird way, like birds. My grandma just said they were touched by the mountain. That's what people called it when something was wrong with you, but you couldn't put a name on it. Touched by the mountain. Ethan repeated the phrase in his mind, filing it away. It was a perfect, chilling euphemism for something inexplicable. Armed with this new lead, Ethan made his way to the Blackwood Public Library, a small brick building that smelled of old paper and dust. The librarian, a stern-looking woman in a tweed blazer, was immediately suspicious of him. He gave her the same story about his research, and she pointed him to a back corner with a sigh, not bothering to hide her disdain. The local history section was a gold mine of forgotten stories. He sifted through crumbling newspapers and worn, leather-bound books. It took him hours, but he finally found it. A single faded article from 1928 titled The Finch Inquiry, a case of hereditary malady or sin. The article detailed a series of strange events attributed to the Caldwell family, a family that, until then, had been a prominent part of the community. A neighbor's livestock mysteriously mutilated, a series of fires that seemed to start and then extinguish themselves, and a string of unexplained disappearances that were quickly dismissed by the town's leadership. The article mentioned that the family was under the care of a doctor, Alistair Finch, a physician who had arrived in Blackwood with an interest in a new field, psychology. He was trying to determine if the Caldwells suffered from a familial neurosis. The investigation was shut down, and Dr. Finch was forced to leave town. The Caldwells then retreated, cutting off all contact with the outside world. Ethan's heart raced. A doctor, a paper trail. This was the proof he needed. He looked for more articles, but the trail went cold. It was as if the town had deliberately erased the Caldwells from its history. A collective act of willful amnesia. He took out his camera and began to photograph the article and the few other mentions he could find. A brief mention in a county records book noted that the Caldwells' property was a designated sanctuary, a term used to describe a place where the mentally ill could be kept safe and secluded from the public. This was not a possession of a spirit. It was a societal possession of a dangerous secret. As he was preparing to leave, the librarian approached him, her voice low. "I saw what you were looking at," she said. "Dr. Finch's house is still out there. It's been empty for 50 years, maybe more. It's on Old Mill Road near the creek. It was a clinic. People say it's haunted." Ethan's stomach clenched. "Haunted?" "By the quiet," she said, her eyes wide. "They say Dr. Finch went mad trying to understand them. You're not the first to go looking for answers, and you won't be the last, but you should be the last person to find them." She then walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the quiet aisle, the scent of dust and fear clinging to the air. The warning was clear. He was getting closer, and with every step, the sense of dread that had followed him since the Caldwell house was growing stronger. He walked out of the library and unlocked his car. As he drove away, he checked his rearview mirror. An old, beat-up dark blue truck was slowly pulling out from a side street a few blocks away. It didn't have a license plate. It was following him. The old Ford truck, its paint peeling like sunburned skin, stayed a few hundred yards behind Ethan's car as he drove back to the motel. He took a few unnecessary turns, navigating the small town's grid with practiced ease. The truck never lost him. The pursuit was slow, deliberate. A grim game of cat and mouse in a place where cats were the only predators. Ethan's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but his mind was a cold, efficient machine. They weren't just watching him. They were establishing their dominance, showing him that his every move was known. He returned to his motel room, locked the door, and peered through a gap in the blinds. The truck was parked across the street, its engine idling. Two dark silhouettes inside. They weren't going to let him go to the clinic alone. He needed a plan. He had to be smarter, faster. He spent the rest of the evening studying the local map and an old topographical map he had purchased at the gas station. He found a disused fire break that ran through the woods and came out near Old Mill Road, a few hundred yards past where the clinic would be. It was a risky move, but it would give him a chance to get there without being followed. He left a note on his bed, a simple message to himself in case something went wrong, and then went to sleep with a wrench from his car tucked under his pillow. He left before dawn, the air still thick with an icy fog. He drove a few miles out of town, parked his car in a discreet spot, and then made his way into the woods, following the fire break. The cold was a physical presence, and the rustling of his coat and the crunch of leaves under his feet felt deafening in the silence. The old clinic was a 2-story wooden structure, its once pristine white paint now a moldy gray. The windows were boarded up and the front door was hanging off its hinges. The air smelled of decay, not just of wood, but of something deeper, something institutional. Ethan entered, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The place was a ruin. The waiting room was filled with overturned chairs, and the reception desk was a mess of rotting paper. He found the clinic's records room, a small locked office. He used the wrench to pry the door open, the wood splintering with a loud crack. Inside, rows of filing cabinets stood like sentinels, filled with old patient files. Most were for routine checkups and common ailments. He found one marked Caldwell. The folder was thin and contained only a few pages, a brief patient history, a list of symptoms, anxiety, paranoia, extreme social withdrawal, and a few prescriptions that had never been filled. But then, tucked inside the folder, he found something else. A small, leather-bound journal. The ink on the title page was faded, but the name was clear. A. Finch, M.D., Observations on the Caldwell Family. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it. The pages were filled with Dr. Finch's meticulous looping script. The first entries were clinical, detached. Finch noted a pattern of extreme, shared paranoia and a form of non-verbal communication that resembled a kind of sign language, but with unnatural, precise movements. He wrote about the family's strange rituals, isolating the young, teaching them to fear the outside world, and an obsession with the number 5. Finch initially believed it was a shared mental disorder, a form of hereditary paranoia. But as his observations deepened, his tone changed. August 18, 1928. The young boy, Thomas, a child of barely 7, refuses to speak. His father forces him to sit in a locked room for hours, holding up his hand, always his hand. It is not a gesture of defiance, but a lesson. The father holds up 5 fingers. This is the law. The boy copies it. The look in his eyes. There is no innocence, only fear. And then, after the lesson is complete, nothing. It is as if a part of his spirit has been taken away. Finch's entries became more frantic. He wrote about the family's deep-seated belief that they were possessing their children, not with a spirit, but with their own will, their own fears, a forced inheritance of psychological torment. The possession was a metaphor for a form of extreme generational abuse, a chilling legacy passed down to ensure the family's insular, toxic world remained intact. The ritual of the 5 fingers was the means of their complete control. It was a reminder of the generations that came before them and the generations that must follow in their paranoid footsteps. The sacrifice wasn't a life, but the individual's will, their humanity. He found a hidden compartment in a desk drawer. Inside were a stack of old photos of Caldwells from different generations, a series of them dating back to the late 1800s. In every single one, the family members had the same dead, vacant stare, and in many of the portraits, a child was shown with a strained, unnatural grip, holding up 5 fingers. Ethan recognized the unsettling symbol from the carving on the tree. It wasn't a mystical symbol. It was a sign of their servitude. Suddenly, a loud creak from the floorboards above him shattered the silence. Someone was in the clinic. The truck. They had found his car and followed him on foot. He shoved the journal and the photos into his bag and scrambled out of the clinic through a back window, just as the sound of footsteps echoed on the main staircase. He ran into the trees, the wrench still clutched in his hand, his heart pounding in his ears. He looked back just as the dark forms of two men entered the clinic, their silhouettes a terrifyingly familiar sight in the dim light of dawn. Ethan didn't stop running until he reached his car, his lungs burning and his hands shaking. He drove back to his motel room, his mind a whirlwind of fear and revelation. He had found his story, but it was far more sinister than he could have imagined. The possession was not supernatural. It was a cruel and brutal form of inherited psychological abuse, a tradition of breaking a child's will and rebuilding it in the image of the family's paranoia. He laid out the photos and the journal on his bed, the weight of the truth crushing down on him. Dr. Finch had known. He had understood the nature of the horror, and it had driven him out of town. The town's collective amnesia wasn't just a matter of forgetting, it was a desperate act of survival, a way to keep the monster in the woods where it belonged. He knew he couldn't go to the police alone, not with a story like this. He needed a witness, someone who could lend his account credibility. He remembered seeing a young deputy at the gas station, a man who seemed less hardened by the mountain than his older peers. He found the Blackwood Sheriff's Department, a small building attached to the county courthouse. The deputy's name was Brody, a man in his late 20s with an honest face and a weary expression. Ethan laid out the entire story, showing Brody the journal and the photos. He watched as the deputy's skepticism turned to disbelief, then to a horrified, grim understanding. Brody pointed to one of the photos, a picture of a young boy holding up his hand in the five-fingered symbol. This is the Caldwells' son. He's still a boy. His name is Leo. The realization hit Ethan like a physical blow. The boy was still out there, a prisoner in his own home, about to have his spirit sacrificed. He told Brody about the note and the truck, and the deputy's expression hardened. The disappearances. There've been a few over the years, Brody said, his voice low. Folks just say they left town, but we've had a few kids go missing near that old Hollow Ridge road, 2 teenagers 10 years back. The family just said they never saw them. We had no evidence. He looked at the journal again, a deep sadness in his eyes. This changes everything. We need to go back out there. We need to find proof of the abuse, something we can use to get a warrant. We can't just raid the place on a hunch. They decided to go back to the Caldwell house, this time with a plan. Brody would wait a few hundred yards back in his car, providing backup and a way to call for help. Ethan would go in alone and try to find a way to document the evidence. He knew it was a risk, but he was driven by a new purpose: to save Leo, the boy who was about to be broken by his family's legacy. He waited until nightfall, the air cold and damp. He approached the house, the moon a sliver of light against a bruised sky. He found a small, unsecured cellar door on the side of the house, partially hidden by a thicket of weeds. He slipped inside. The air was cold and smelled of mold and damp earth. He found a set of stairs leading to the main house. The floorboards above him creaked. Someone was home. He moved with agonizing slowness, his senses on high alert. He found a secret compartment under the staircase. Inside, he found what he was looking for: journals from generations of Caldwells. He started to photograph the pages, his hands shaking. The entries were a horrifying confirmation of Dr. Finch's theories. Each generation spoke of the lesson and the inheritance, their euphemisms for the psychological torture. The most recent journal, belonging to the current patriarch Silas, was the most chilling. He wrote about the weakness he perceived in his son, Leo, He wrote about the need to correct him, to purify him, and make him truly a Caldwell. The last entry was a celebration. "The test has begun," he wrote. "The sickness from the outside is here. The boy will learn." Ethan realized with a jolt of ice-cold fear that Silas wasn't talking about Ethan's arrival as a new obstacle. He was talking about Ethan as a part of the ritual. He was using Ethan to instill fear in his son, to show him the dangers of the outside world. He heard footsteps coming down the stairs and he scrambled to his feet. He had to get out, and fast. He left one of the photos from the clinic, a picture of a past Caldwell patriarch, on the ground, a silent message that he had been there. He slipped back out the way he came, just as the light from a lantern illuminated the stairs. He ran back to Brody's car and they sped away from the house, the feeling of being hunted more intense than ever before. Ethan had the evidence, but the hunter had become the hunted. They had seen his face. They knew he had been inside their home. The game had just begun. If you're on the edge of your seat and need to know what happens to Ethan and the Caldwell family, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this unfolding nightmare. Remember, this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental. The evidence was on the table. The journals, the photos from the abandoned clinic, and the chilling new entries from Silas Caldwell's journal. Brody stared at the documents, his face a mask of sickened disbelief. "We can get a warrant now," he said, his voice a low growl of anger. I've never seen anything like it. It's not just abuse. It's a generational sickness. A prison they built for themselves and now they're trying to drag you into it." Ethan felt the cold knot of fear in his stomach, but it was now laced with a steely resolve. He had what he came for, but now he had to save the boy. He and Brody spent the night poring over the evidence, meticulously piecing together the family's history of ritualistic abuse and the few missing persons cases Brody had been unable to solve. The pieces fit together with a terrible, horrifying clarity. The missing teenagers hadn't run away. They had stumbled too close to the Caldwell property, and the family's extreme paranoia had led them to believe the outsiders were a threat that needed to be eliminated. "They're not just reclusive," Brody said, his voice shaking with a quiet rage. "They're dangerous, and they know you have what you need to put them away." Ethan knew they had to act fast. The Caldwells wouldn't wait for the legal system to catch up with them. They would be coming for him. Brody called in a few more deputies, reliable men who had been born and raised in the mountains and knew how to operate in the wilderness. The plan was to go to the Caldwell house with a small team and demand the family come out. They were prepared for resistance, but not for what they found. As the team's vehicles approached Hollow Ridge, the air grew thick and still. The oppressive silence was back, but this time it was different. It felt like a trap. The house was exactly as Ethan had left it, but the chilling stillness was absolute. Not a single curtain moved in the wind. Not a sound came from within. They used a bullhorn to announce their presence, demanding the Caldwells show themselves. The only response was the wind whistling through the broken windows. Brody and Ethan, followed by 2 other deputies, entered the house with their weapons drawn. The interior was clean, organized, and eerily sterile. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing to indicate they had left in a hurry. The journals and documents Ethan had found in the secret compartment were gone. Brody and his men searched every room. No one was there. The Caldwells had vanished. "They're gone," Brody said, his voice laced with frustration. "They knew we were coming." But as they walked through the living room, Ethan saw a piece of paper on the floor. It was a page torn from Silas's journal. It contained the final entry Ethan had photographed, but with a new addition written at the bottom in the same spidery scrawl. "We will find you, and you will learn our lesson." Ethan's stomach twisted. He had been so focused on getting the evidence and saving the boy, he had forgotten the first rule of the mountain: never underestimate what lives in the shadows. The Caldwells weren't just reclusive. They were survivalists, masters of the terrain, and their paranoia had made them ruthless. They had a network of hidden trails and supply caches, and they would use their deep-seated knowledge of the wilderness to hunt him down. He had taken their secret, and now they were coming for him. They returned to the sheriff's office, the evidence now of physical absence in their hands. They had the photos and the copies, but they had lost the physical proof and the family itself. Brody was able to issue a bulletin for a search party, but he knew it was a long shot. The Caldwells could disappear into the mountains for months, years even. The hunt was on, but it wasn't a law enforcement search. It was a personal vendetta. That night, as Ethan sat in his motel room, a chilling realization hit him. The Caldwells had left him a clue at the house. They wanted him to know they had gone. They weren't hiding. They were hunting. The silent threat that had followed him since the beginning had now become a very real, very present danger. The town of Blackwood, the one he had seen as a refuge, now felt like a cage. He was in their territory, and they were closing in. He was no longer a journalist seeking a story. He was a character in one of their twisted, horrifying tales, and the final chapter had yet to be written. He was the next outsider to be taught the lesson of the mountain. The stillness of the motel room felt more threatening than any creaking floorboard or gust of wind on Hollow Ridge. Every sound from outside, the hum of an old refrigerator, the muffled laughter from a neighboring room, felt like a taunt, a reminder of a normal world he was being slowly separated from. The note he had in his hand was the new ghost in the gears, a chilling testament to their meticulous, deranged minds. They had planned this. They had calculated his every move, his every discovery, and they had used it all to turn the tables. He was no longer the hunter with a camera and a notebook. He was the prey. The air in his lungs felt heavy, a suffocating weight of dread he hadn't known before. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over Brody's number, but he stopped. What could he say? They're not running, they're stalking me. The idea sounded insane, something out of a bad horror movie. Yet the icy certainty of it was absolute. They had left the note to make him afraid, to make him understand that this was a game on their terms. The goal wasn't to escape. It was to eliminate the threat, and the family's singular obsessive focus made them more terrifying than any wild animal. He was trapped in a small, isolated town, and the monsters in the dark were coming for him. The storm arrived with the weight of the Caldwells' threat. Rain lashed against the motel window, a drumming that was a constant reminder of the tightening circle around Ethan. Brody had organized a search team, but the pouring rain had made it impossible to track anything. Ethan knew this was a deliberate advantage for the family. They were creatures of the woods, fluent in the language of the terrain, and the storm was their accomplice. The hunter was a creature of the city, and the elements were his enemy. The next morning the rain had subsided, but the fog was so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet in front of him. Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't wait for a search team that was moving at a snail's pace. He had to think like them. He had to use their paranoia against them. He called Brody and told him he was going back into the woods, but this time he wouldn't be looking for them. He'd be looking for their path. He found a hidden trail, barely a deer path, leading from the back of the Caldwell property. It was a labyrinth of tangled branches and treacherous mud. He moved slowly, his senses on high alert, his mind a constant stream of questions. Where would they go? Why would they leave the safety of their home? The answer came to him with chilling clarity. They weren't hiding. They were setting a trap. They knew he had the evidence. They would want to get rid of him and the proof. As he walked, he felt the same suffocating feeling of being watched that he had felt on his first trip to Hollow Ridge. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves was a footstep. He imagined the Caldwells moving silently through the trees, their cold eyes watching him, assessing his every move. He was a piece on a chessboard, and they were the masters of the game. He found a small hidden campsite under a rock overhang. It was crude but efficient. A few bags of supplies, a small stove, and a fresh stack of wood. They weren't starving. They were preparing for a prolonged hunt. He found a small leather-bound notebook lying on a tree stump. It was another journal entry from Silas. "The intruder is here. He has the sickness. He is a test. The boy will learn from him. We will teach him our way. The outside world is a poison. We will show him what it does to those who challenge our truth. The lesson will be a beautiful thing to watch. We will show him the sickness, and then we will eliminate it." The entry confirmed Ethan's fears. He wasn't just a threat to them. He was a tool for their twisted lesson. He had become a part of their ritual, a living, breathing example of the poison of the outside world. He took a photo of the journal page and moved on, the sense of dread now a physical weight on his shoulders. He heard a sound then, not a footstep, a whisper, a child's voice calling his name. "Ethan!" The voice was faint, carried on the wind. He stopped, his heart pounding. It couldn't be. Was it a trick? He listened again. "Ethan, help me." The voice was coming from all around him. It was a recording, a sinister, clever tactic designed to play on his humanity, to draw him in. He realized with a sick lurch of his stomach that he was surrounded. They were closing in. He looked up, and through the thick fog he saw a fleeting shadow, a brief, terrifying glimpse of a man holding a child's hand. He was at a dead end. The hunter had walked straight into the trap, and the wolves were closing in. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the veil of his professional resolve. He had to think. The recording was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a way to lure him in, to make him think he was rescuing Leo. But he knew, with a horrifying certainty, that this wasn't about the boy's rescue. It was about his own downfall. He had seen the way the Caldwells' minds worked. They were predators, and their greatest weapon was not force, but manipulation. He had to fight that with his own mind, his own truth. He took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to calm the frantic thrum of his pulse. He had to expose their game for what it was, not just to himself, but to them. He would not be broken. As he moved, the shadows in the fog seemed to twist and stretch, elongating into grotesque, humanoid forms. He could almost feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment. The air grew colder, and a new sound joined the recording. A faint, eerie rustle that seemed to come from all directions, like a chorus of dry leaves whispering his name. He was in their world now, a world of shadows and echoes of secrets and fear. He had to remember that the fear was the real enemy, not the fog, not the rustling leaves, but the dread they were trying to plant in his heart. He was a rational man, a man of facts, and he would not succumb to their ancient, monstrous truths. Ethan stood frozen in the forest, the child's voice, a recording, whispering his name from the unseen trees. The psychological assault was working. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. The dense fog made it impossible to see. He knew this was the Caldwells' moment. They were not going to use violence first. They were going to try and break him psychologically, just as they had their own son. They were going to show him the true meaning of the lesson. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. He was a journalist. He had to be smarter than this. He focused on the sound. It was coming from small, hidden speakers, crudely disguised in the brush. He moved toward the source of the sound, not to find the family, but to find a way out of the trap. He found one, then another, and another. He realized the speakers were set up in a semicircle. They had corralled him. He was a rat in a maze, and they were waiting for him to break. But he wouldn't. He had a weapon far more dangerous than anything they had. He knew their secret. He took out his phone, and with the flashlight function on, He found a rock and a broken piece of a log. He began to beat the rock against the log in a rhythmic, loud noise. It was a signal. He had told Brody to listen for a distinct pattern if he needed help. The beating was a message, a cry for help. The whispers stopped instantly. They had heard him. They knew he was not going to break. He had a final card to play. He pulled out the photo of Leo's toy car he had found on the last visit. He held it up, and with a loud, clear voice he shouted, "Silas, I know about the lesson. I know what you've been doing to your son. You're not protecting him. You're destroying him." There was a long, chilling silence. Then a voice, cold and devoid of emotion, came from the fog. It was Silas. "He needs to be a Caldwell. He needs to know what we know. He needs to be pure." "Pure," Ethan scoffed, his voice laced with a fury he didn't know he possessed. "You're a monster, Silas. You're a coward who's afraid of the world, and you're turning your son into the same thing. This isn't protection, it's a prison. You're just passing on your sickness to him." He heard a low growl of pure, unrestrained rage from the fog, and then a shadowy figure charged out of the mist, brandishing a large hunting knife. It was Silas. He was a large man, and his eyes were full of a cold, insane fury. Ethan stood his ground, not running, not flinching. He had to get through to him. He had to save the boy. He took out the photo of the toy car. "This is your son, Silas. This is all that's left of him. He's trying to tell you something. He wants to be free. He wants to play, to be a child, not a ghost of his father's paranoia." Silas stopped, his arm raised, the knife glinting in the faint light. His eyes flickered between Ethan and the photo, and for a split second, a look of pure agony crossed his face. He saw the truth, the monster he had become, the prison he had built, not just for his son, but for himself. He saw it all. The madness, the abuse, the years of silent suffering. He screamed, a broken, defeated sound, and dropped the knife to the ground. Ethan stood his ground, his hands still shaking, his body drenched in cold sweat. He had done it. He had faced the monster, not with violence, but with truth. The sound of a siren in the distance cut through the air. Brody and his team were on their way. The hunt was over. The lesson had been taught, but not in the way the Caldwells had intended. A new figure emerged from the fog, a silent, menacing presence. It was Silas's wife, her face a mask of cold, unblinking fury. She didn't look at Ethan. She looked at her husband, at the man she had been taught to follow, who was now a broken husk on the ground. A single guttural scream escaped her lips, a sound of pure, raw grief and rage. It wasn't for her husband, but for the truth he had been forced to see. She was the final tragic piece of the puzzle, a woman whose entire world had been built on a foundation of lies. And now, it was crumbling around her. She lunged, not at Ethan, but at the fallen knife, a terrifying primal look in her eyes. But Brody's team arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the fog like a searchlight. The world around Ethan was no longer a terrifying labyrinth. It was a crime scene. As deputies secured the Caldwells, Brody found Leo huddled behind a tree, trembling but safe. Ethan looked at the boy, at the small, frightened face that had been the subject of his hunt, and felt a profound sense of relief. He hadn't just gotten a story. He had saved a life. The hunt was over, the mystery solved, but the truth remained, a cold and chilling reminder of the ghosts we create for ourselves. He had faced the monsters in the dark with the one thing they couldn't endure, the truth. If you've been on this terrifying journey and want to see how this dark story ends, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the final chapters of this unforgettable nightmare. Silas collapsed to his knees, his face buried in his hands, his body racked with defeated sobs. The fury that had driven him for generations was gone, replaced by a hollow, gut-wrenching despair. the very foundation of his life. The inherited fear, the unwavering hatred for the outside world, the brutal psychological control, had been shattered by Ethan's simple, undeniable truth. His wife, a woman who had been a silent, menacing presence in the thick fog, emerged from the trees. Her face was a mask of cold fury, but without Silas's frantic will to guide her, she was a ship without a rudder, a puppet whose strings had been cut. She stood silently, her eyes a mix of hatred and something Ethan couldn't quite decipher. A primal, animal fear of the outside world, a terror so deeply ingrained it was all she had ever known. She had been taught to hate him, to fear him, and now, without her husband's lead, she was lost, unmoored in a world she couldn't understand. Brody and his team arrived moments later, their flashlights cutting through the thick, wet air. The beams danced over the scene, illuminating Ethan standing over the broken man and the silent, defiant woman. They took Silas and his wife into custody without a fight. The family's strange, eerie stillness, a jarring contrast to the frantic energy of the police. The search party found Leo, the young boy, a few hundred yards away, huddled behind a large oak tree, trembling. He had heard Ethan's words, and he had seen his father's breakdown. For the first time in his life, he was truly safe, for now. When Brody approached him, the boy didn't shrink away. He just looked at the deputy with wide, bewildered eyes, the terror on his face slowly giving way to a nascent, fragile hope. The next few hours were a whirlwind of interviews, debriefings, and paperwork. Ethan gave his statement, detailing everything he had uncovered, from the old town records and the eerie, faded newspaper clippings to Dr. Finch's frantic final journal. Brody laid out the evidence, the photos, the copies of the journals, and the new testimony from the Caldwells themselves. It was enough. The Caldwells were charged with child endangerment and extreme psychological abuse, not for murder, but for the disappearances of the teenagers, who they now confessed to having scared away with a sick game of psychological terror. The teens had run into the woods, but they had not been killed. They had simply run too far, gotten lost, and were too terrified to ever speak about their experience. One of them, now an adult, had moved to another state and had been the original poster on the forgotten forum Ethan had found. The missing persons cases were closed, but the pain and fear they had suffered would never truly heal. The town of Blackwood was a mix of quiet relief and morbid curiosity. The truth about the Caldwells was out. The unspoken fear that had haunted the town for generations was finally gone, replaced by a grim, shared understanding. Ethan, however, felt no sense of triumph. He had his story, a career-making piece of journalism, but it had come at a heavy cost. He had faced a darkness he had never known existed, a darkness that was born not of the supernatural, but of the human heart. He had survived, but a part of him had been changed forever, a ghost of the man he had been before he went to Hollow Ridge. He had a brief, gut-wrenching moment of understanding for the town's silence. They weren't protecting the Caldwells, they were protecting themselves. They had accepted a terrible bargain. They would look away from a known evil in the woods, as long as it never came into town. Before he left town, Brody handed him a small, battered toy car. It was Leo's. He had left it behind when he was taken into custody. "He wanted you to have it," Brody said, his voice soft. "He said you were his hero." Ethan held the toy in his hand, a small tangible symbol of the battle he had won. It wasn't a hero's prize, but a reminder of the boy he had saved, and the cycle he had broken. He thanked Brody, shook his hand, and got in his car. The drive back to D.C. was a silent one. The Appalachian Mountains, once a place of terrifying mystery, were now just a landscape, a beautiful but deeply scarred landscape. He arrived back at his apartment, the note from the Caldwells still in his wallet. He placed it on his desk, next to the photos and the journals he had copied. He would write his article. Not a sensational headline about a possessed family, but a chilling exposé on the dangers of inherited trauma, of how generations of fear and abuse can create a prison more terrifying than any supernatural force. The story was over, but the ghosts would remain. The ghosts of the Caldwell family, a ghost of a boy who would have to learn how to live in a world he was taught to fear, and the ghost of the man Ethan had been before he went to Hollow Ridge. He was no longer just a journalist. He was a witness to a truth so horrifying it had almost cost him his life. The hunter had become the hunted, but in the end, he had emerged victorious, not by brute force, but by facing the monsters in the dark with the one thing they couldn't endure: the truth. Ethan's return to D.C. was an anticlimax. The city's familiar clamor, once a source of comfort, now felt like a hollow noise. The stories he had once chased, political scandals and petty crimes, seemed insignificant, trivial. His apartment, a place of quiet refuge, felt like a cage. He had the Caldwell story, all of it, laid out on his desk. The photographs of the faded journals, the copies of Dr. Finch's notes, even the small battered toy car from Leo. The evidence was irrefutable. But the story itself was a ghost in his mind, haunting his every waking moment. It wasn't about a possessed family, it was about a generational sickness. A silent, psychological virus passed down from one tortured mind to the next. He started writing, the words flowing from him in a torrent of cold, hard truth. He didn't use sensationalism, he used facts. He wrote about the isolation, the ritualistic abuse, the forced paranoia, and the deep-seated fear of a family that had become a prison for itself. He wrote about Leo, the child who had become the final hope for breaking the cycle. He wrote about Brody, the skeptical lawman who had become a trusted ally. He wrote about the town of Blackwood and the silent agreement to forget a terrifying truth. And he wrote about himself, a city journalist who had gone searching for a story and had found something far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The article was a masterpiece. It was a harrowing, chilling account of a horror that was not of the supernatural, but of the human psyche. He sent it to his editor, who called him in a state of stunned silence. This is incredible, Ethan," his editor said, his voice filled with an uncharacteristic awe. "It's not just a story, it's a wake-up call. It's a human horror story. It's what journalism is supposed to be." The article was published and it went viral, not for its sensationalism, but for its chilling realism. People were horrified, captivated by the silent terror of a family that had gone to war with the world from the inside out. Ethan was a hero, a celebrated journalist who had uncovered a dark, forgotten truth. But he felt no triumph. He felt a profound sense of loss, a weight of a truth he could never unsee. The haunted look in the Caldwells' eyes, the raw terror in Leo's, the quiet fear on the faces of the people of Blackwood, these were the things that stayed with him, not the headlines or the accolades. He had a brief, painful moment of clarity. He had been so focused on getting the story, on exposing the truth, that he had forgotten the emotional toll it would take. The story was now a part of him, a ghost in the gears of his own mind, a dark truth that would forever affect how he saw the world. He kept in touch with Brody, who updated him on the Caldwells. He learned that Silas and his wife were in a high-security psychiatric facility, being evaluated by a team of specialists. They were being studied, not as criminals, but as a medical anomaly. A perfect example of hereditary psychological trauma. Leo, the boy, was in a foster home in another state. He was getting help, therapy, and a chance at a normal life. Brody sent Ethan a photo of Leo, a small, tentative smile on his face, holding a soccer ball in a green, sunlit field. He was free, The Caldwells were no longer a possession. They were a case study, a ghost in the gears of a perfectly functional, seemingly normal world. Their story was a chilling testament to the fact that the most terrifying monsters are not in the shadows, but in the twisted, broken landscapes of the human mind. The real horror of Hollow Ridge was not a spirit, but a family that had chosen to build a prison for its own soul and had almost succeeded in dragging an entire town into its silent, terrifying hell. The hunt was over, the mystery solved, but the truth remained, a cold and chilling reminder of the ghosts we create for ourselves. Months passed. The article became a landmark piece of investigative journalism. Ethan had received offers from major news outlets, book deals, and even a movie option, but he couldn't bring himself to sign. The story was not a commodity to be sold. It was a lesson he had learned, a truth he had to carry. He had faced the darkness, but the darkness had also faced him. He was a different man now, haunted not by a ghost, but by the reality of what humanity was capable of. He would never look at a reclusive family, a quiet town, or a child with a strange look in their eyes the same way again. He was sitting at his desk, staring at the old, worn note from the Caldwells. "We know who you are." The words, once a chilling threat, now seemed like a hollow echo from a distant past. He picked up the note, a faint smile on his lips. He was no longer afraid. He was no longer just an observer. He had a different purpose now. He was a storyteller, a journalist who would no longer chase headlines, but who would seek out the quiet human horrors that existed beneath the surface of a seemingly normal world. He stood up, walked to his window, and looked out at the city lights. They were bright and they felt warm. He was back in his world, but he knew there was another world out there, a world of quiet truths and silent monsters. A world he had almost gotten lost in. He would never forget the silence of Hollow Ridge, the fear of the chase, or the haunting truth about the Caldwell family. He was a survivor, not of a supernatural haunting, but of a very human horror. He was a witness, and he would never stop telling the story. He picked up the note again, folded it neatly, and placed it in a small, locked box. A reminder. A final word from the Appalachian family that had tried to possess him and had, in a way, succeeded. Not with a curse, but with a terrifying, undeniable truth. If you've been on this terrifying journey with Ethan, from the moment he found the first clue to his final confrontation with the truth, we want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story of real-world horror. Remember, this is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental.